It's June 18th, 1954. You're sitting in a dimly lit living room in Guatemala City. The power grid has been fluctuating all week. Outside your window, the sky is bruised and gray, but the rain isn't the only thing falling from it. You turn the dial on the radio, desperate for news. The state broadcaster giving you nothing but static. But then, you catch a frequency.
Atención Guatemala. Radio Liberación, la voz del Ejército Libertador de Guatemala, en el aire. Mucha atención, noticias importantes.
The station calls itself La Voz de la Liberación, the voice of liberation. The announcer's voice is frantic, urgent. He tells you that a massive, heavily armed rebel army has crossed the border from Honduras. He says that the Guatemalan military is defecting by the thousands. He reads reports of battles in the countryside, of tanks rolling through the jungle, of columns of soldiers marching on the capital. He tells you that the president is terrified, that the government is in a state of total collapse.
Atención Guatemala, atención Guatemala, mucha atención guatemaltecos.
That the end is already there. You look out the window. You see a towering pillar of thick, black smoke rising from the edge of the city. Fuel tanks are burning. You are terrified. Your neighbors are terrified. The generals in the army headquarters also terrified. But here's the truth. Almost everything you're hearing and everything you're seeing is a hallucination. It's a ghost story, engineered in a laboratory. There is no massive rebel army. The invading force is actually just 480 poorly trained mercenaries, and they're currently stuck in the mud, pinned down by local police a few miles past the border. They haven't won a single battle. The radio station isn't broadcasting from a secret rebel camp in the jungle. The signal is being beamed from a transmitter in Nicaragua, and the scripts were written by psychological warfare experts in a CIA safe house in Miami. And those fighter planes, they aren't dropping military-grade bombs. They're being flown by American mercenaries who are literally tossing blocks of dynamite tied to hand grenades out of the cockpit windows. They aren't trying to destroy the military base. They're just trying to make noise. They're trying to make you feel like you've already lost. And it's working. Within 10 days, a democratically elected government will fall. A nation will be plunged into 40 years of civil war and genocide. Over 200,000 people will be killed or disappeared. But this wasn't a military conquest. And it wasn't a noble battle against Soviet communism, no matter what the history books in the US tell you. This was a corporate restructuring. It was a coup orchestrated, funded, and lobbied for by a fruit company. A company decided that it was cheaper to overthrow a sovereign nation than to pay its property taxes. They tell you that business is just a game of numbers, margins, quarters, stock prices. They are lying. When the stakes get high enough, the boardroom becomes a war room. And in the corporate wars, there are no rules of engagement. I'm Tomislav Kravzel. Today, we're looking at the ultimate proof of concept for corporate sovereignty. We're looking at the origin of the Banana Republic. We are looking at El Pulpo, the octopus, the United Fruit Company. Welcome to Corporate Wars. Act 1. The Anatomy of an Octopus. To understand the events of June 1954, we have to dismantle a myth. When we study history, we're taught that the world is run by nation-states, countries, presidents, prime ministers, kings, and parliaments. We assume that sovereignty, the absolute right to govern a piece of land, belongs to the government of that land. But if you lived in Central America in the early to mid-20th century, you knew that was a lie. Sovereignty didn't reside in the presidential palaces of Guatemala City. It resided in the wood-paneled boardrooms of Boston and New Orleans. Before we get to the Cold War, before we get to the CIA, we have to look at the term itself, Banana Republic. Today, if a politician wants to insult a country, they call it a Banana Republic. People think it means a country that's naturally chaotic, a place where politicians are corrupt and the institutions are weak. But that's not what the term means. It was originally coined in 1904 by the American writer O. Henry, whose real name was William Sidney Porter. He was hiding out from the law in Honduras, avoiding embezzlement charges. He wrote a book of short stories called Cabbages and Kings. When O. Henry wrote about a Banana Republic, he wasn't describing a country that was naturally unstable. He was describing a country that had been made unstable on purpose. A country whose entire existence, economy, and government had been hollowed out and turned into a subsidiary of foreign fruit trusts. And no company perfected this model quite like the United Fruit Company. To the people of Latin America, the United Fruit Company was known as El Pulpo, the octopus, because its tentacles wrapped around everything. Let's look at the sheer, suffocating scale of their monopoly in Guatemala by the 1950s. If you were an independent Guatemalan coffee farmer and you wanted to sell your beans to the world, you had to put them on a train to the Atlantic coast. But you couldn't just charter a train. United Fruit owned the international railways of Central America. They owned the only tracks. They set the rates. If they decided to charge you double, you paid it, or your coffee rotted on the platform. Once the coffee got to the port of Puerto Barrios, it had to get on a ship. But United Fruit owned the Great White Fleet. They controlled the maritime logistics. If you wanted to send a telegram to a buyer in New York, you had to use the Tropical Radio and Telegraph Company, owned by United Fruit. And land, the United Fruit Company was the single largest landowner in the entire country of Guatemala. They weren't a corporation operating inside a country. Guatemala was a country operating inside their corporation.
I get evil, evil. Well, I get evil, baby.
But how does a company get that powerful? How do they establish a culture where they feel comfortable dictating the terms to a foreign government? For that, we have to look at the villain archetype. We have to look at a man named Sam Zemurray. They called him Sam the Banana Man. Zemurray was a Russian Jewish immigrant. He started his career at the absolute bottom. In the late 1890s, he was standing on the docks of New Orleans, buying ripes, bananas that were turning brown and had to be sold locally before they rotted. He hustled. He fought. He built his own company, the Guatemala Fruit Company, into a ruthless competitor, and eventually, in a hostile boardroom takeover in 1933, he took over United Fruit itself. Sam Zimuri is critical to this story because he established the precedent. He proved a dark mathematical theorem. If a government threatens your profit margins, it's cheaper to buy a new government. Let's go back to 1911. Zimuri is running his banana operations in Honduras. The Honduran government owes a massive debt to the British, and the U.S. State Department steps in. Secretary of State Philander Knox brokers a deal with J.P. Morgan to restructure the debt. But part of the deal means placing U.S. agents in the Honduran custom houses to collect taxes and duties. For Zimuri, this is unacceptable. Taxes cut into margins. Most CEOs would hire a lobbyist in Washington. They would write letters. They would negotiate. But Sam Zimuri didn't negotiate. He uttered a phrase that should be engraved over the door of every corporate ethics class in the world. He said, "A mule costs more than a deputy." When Zimuri realized he couldn't bribe his way out of the J.P. Morgan deal, he decided to finance a private revolution. He walked down to the underworld of New Orleans and hired 2 mercenaries, real soldiers of fortune, a guy named Lee Christmas and a Boer War veteran known as Guy Machine Gun Maloney. Zimuri bought a decommissioned U.S. Navy ship called the Hornet. Right under the noses of the U.S. Secret Service, they loaded the ship with machine guns, rifles, ammunition, and a former exiled Honduran president named Manuel Bonilla. They sailed out of the harbor, landed on the coast of Honduras, and literally shot their way to the capital. They overthrew the government of President Miguel Davila, and they put their guy Bonilla back in the presidential chair. And what did Zimuri get for his trouble? The newly installed puppet president granted him 24,700 acres of prime land and a complete waiver on all taxes and duties. (1911). That was the year the Banana Republic was born in blood. Zimuri proved that a corporation could exercise sovereign impunity. If the laws don't suit you, change the lawmakers with a machine gun. When Zimuri eventually took over the United Fruit Company, he brought this exact DNA into the boardroom. They viewed the countries they operated in not as sovereign nations, but as private fiefdoms. And for decades, Guatemala was their favorite fiefdom. From 1931 to 1944, Guatemala was ruled by General Jorge Ubico. Ubico was an eccentric, brutal dictator who literally thought he was the reincarnation of Napoleon Bonaparte. Ubico loved the United Fruit Company. He signed contracts that exempted them from almost all internal taxes. But worse than the tax breaks, Ubico gave them bodies. He enacted what were called vagrancy laws. Under these laws, any landless peasant, which meant almost the entire indigenous Mayan population, had to carry a passbook. They had to prove they had worked a minimum of 100 to 150 days a year for a major landowner. If the police stopped a Mayan man and his passbook didn't have the stamps, he was arrested for vagrancy. His punishment? He was forced to work on road gangs or forced to work on the United Fruit Company plantations. This was legalized slavery. It guaranteed El Pulpo an endless, terrified, and nearly free labor force. For the men sitting in the plush, cigar smoke-filled rooms of the Boston headquarters, life was perfect. The margins were incredible. The locals were compliant. The government was bought and paid for. But in 1944, the perfect machine broke. The people of Guatemala decided they had had enough. Act 2. The 10 Years of Spring. They call it the October Revolution. No, not that one. In the fall of 1944, the streets of Guatemala City filled with people who were tired of being treated like livestock. It wasn't a communist vanguard. It was university students. It was school teachers. It was young, reform-minded military officers. They organized general strikes. They paralyzed the capital. And, to the shock of the world, they forced the dictator, Jorge Ubico, to resign and flee the country. This ushered in a decade that historians call the 10 Years of Spring. For the very first time in its history, Guatemala held a free, open, democratic election. They elected a man named Juan José Arevalo. Arevalo was a philosophy professor. He had been living in exile in Argentina. He was an intellectual, a big, broad-shouldered man who spoke about something he called spiritual socialism. Now, in the United States in the 1940s, the word socialism was already becoming radioactive. But Arevalo's policies weren't Marxist. They were basically just FDR's New Deal, but imported to Central America. Arevalo introduced a minimum wage. He introduced near-universal suffrage, giving the right to vote to people who had never been allowed near a ballot box. He built hospitals. He built schools. And, crucially, he gave workers the legal right to form unions and strike. To a normal company, giving workers the right to unionize is a headache. You sit down, you negotiate, you lose a little profit, you move on. But to the United Fruit Company, a company built on the blood of the vagrancy laws, a company accustomed to buying presidents and renting armies, this was a declaration of war. For the first time in their history, El Pulpo had to sit across a table and negotiate with the people who picked their fruit. They hated Arevalo. They called him a communist. But Arevalo survived dozens of coup attempts. He finished his term. And in 1951, he handed power over to his successor in a peaceful, democratic transition. The new president was a young, handsome military officer, a colonel, and his name was Jacobo Arbenz. If you read the CIA briefs from 1954, or if you read Time magazine from that era, you will see Jacobo Arbenz described as a hardened Soviet operative. They called him Red Jacobo. They painted him as a man trying to build a Soviet beachhead right in America's backyard. But looking at the actual historical dossier, the reality is completely different. And, in a way, it makes what happened to him even more tragic. Jacobo Arbenz was a capitalist. In his inaugural address, he laid out his vision for Guatemala. He didn't say he wanted to build a workers' paradise modeled on Moscow. He said explicitly that his goal was to transform Guatemala from a backward country with a predominantly feudal economy into a modern, capitalist state. His role model wasn't Joseph Stalin. His role model was Abraham Lincoln. He wanted to build an economy based on private property, industrialization, and a strong middle class. But there was a problem, a massive, unavoidable problem. You cannot build a modern capitalist economy if your citizens don't own any capital. And in Guatemala, the only capital that mattered was land. The inequality was staggering. Less than 2% of the population owned over 70% of the arable land. The vast majority of Guatemalans were landless peasants, starving in the shadow of massive estates. Arbenz knew that to create a middle class, he had to give the people a stake in the country. He had to give them dirt. So, on June 17, 1952, the Guatemalan Congress passed Decree 900, the Agrarian Reform Law. Now, pay close attention to the mechanics of this law, because this is the tripwire that triggered the collapse of the country. Decree 900 did not abolish private property. It did not nationalize the banana industry. It was actually a very moderate law. It targeted only massive estates, properties larger than 672 acres. And crucially, it only targeted the portion of those estates that was fallow, uncultivated, empty. The law stated that if you were hoarding massive amounts of land and not using it, the government had the right to buy that unused land from you and redistribute it to poor families in small plots so they could grow their own food. It affected only about 1,700 estates, a tiny fraction of the landowners. But the United Fruit Company was the biggest landowner of them all. United Fruit owned over 550,000 acres in Guatemala, but they only actively farmed about 15% of it. They kept 85% of their land completely empty. The company claimed they needed this vast reserve of empty land to rotate crops, to protect against a blight called Panama disease that devastated banana roots. But the Guatemalan government, and pretty much every independent economist, saw it differently. They saw a classic monopoly tactic. United Fruit was hoarding the land to ensure no local competitors could ever start their own plantations, and to artificially limit the supply of bananas to keep the prices high in the United States. Under Decree 900, the Arbenz government legally moved to expropriate 234,000 acres of United Fruit's empty, unused land. Now, the government wasn't stealing the land. Decree 900 explicitly stated that landowners would be compensated. They would be paid in 25-year government bonds with a 3% interest rate. But how do you determine what the land is worth? Arbenz and his advisors wrote a brilliant and fatal clause into the law. The government would pay the exact value of the land as declared by the landowner on their 1952 tax returns. The trap was set, and United Fruit had walked right into it. For decades, United Fruit had been committing massive tax fraud. To avoid paying property taxes to the Guatemalan government, they had systematically undervalued their real estate on their tax forms. They swore on legally binding documents that their vast estates were practically worthless. They valued their land at roughly $2.99 an acre. So, Jacobo Arbenz smiled, looked at their tax returns and said, "Okay, we believe you." Based on the company's own sworn tax declarations, the Guatemalan government offered United Fruit $627,572 for the 234,000 acres. The executives in Boston lost their minds. Suddenly, miraculously, the land wasn't worthless anymore. United Fruit claimed the land was actually worth $75 an acre. They demanded nearly $16 million in compensation. Let that sink in. $600,000 versus $16 million. A roughly $15 million discrepancy. That is the price tag of this corporate war. That is what this entire geopolitical crisis boiled down to. A wealthy corporation getting caught in its own tax lie and refusing to take the loss. When Jacobo Arbenz refused to pay the $16 million, pointing out that to do so would be to reward the company for decades of tax evasion, the United Fruit Company didn't take the matter to an international tribunal. The United Fruit Company didn't sue. They looked back at the playbook written by Sam the Banana Man in 1911. A mule costs more than a deputy. Only this time, they didn't need to hire mercenaries in New Orleans. They had something much better. They had the United States government. Act 3. The Interlocking Directorate. If you want to pull off a heist, you need an inside man. If you want to pull off a coup, you need the entire police force on your payroll. When Jacobo Arbenz refused to pay United Fruit's extortionate $16 million demand for their empty land, the executives in Boston didn't panic. They simply picked up the phone and called their friends in Washington, D.C. And I don't mean they called low-level bureaucrats. I mean they called the architects of the free world. In corporate governance, there's a term called an interlocking directorate. It refers to the practice of members of a corporate board of directors serving on the boards of multiple corporations. It concentrates power. It ensures everyone is singing from the same hymn sheet. In 1954, the United Fruit Company had established the ultimate interlocking directorate. They hadn't just interlocked with other businesses. They'd interlocked with the Eisenhower administration. Let's look at the roster. Let's look at the men who decided the fate of Guatemala. First, you have the Secretary of State, the man directing American foreign policy, John Foster Dulles. Before he took office, John Foster Dulles was a senior partner at Sullivan & Cromwell. This was the most powerful Wall Street law firm in the world. And their marquee client? The United Fruit Company. John Foster Dulles had personally spent years negotiating the very contracts in the 1930s that gave the octopus its tax-free status in Guatemala. Next, you have the director of the Central Intelligence Agency, Allen Dulles, John Foster's brother. Allen Dulles had previously served on the United Fruit Company's board of trustees. He had done legal work for them. He owned shares in the company. But it didn't stop with the Dulles brothers. The Assistant Secretary of State for Inter-American Affairs was a man named John Moores Cabot. His family was a major shareholder in United Fruit. In fact, his brother had been the president of the company. President Eisenhower's National Security Advisor, General Robert Cutler, was the former chairman of the board of the Old Colony Trust. What was the Old Colony Trust? It was the transfer agent for the United Fruit Company in Boston. And if that wasn't close enough to the Oval Office, consider this. The public relations director for the United Fruit Company was a man named Edmund S. Whitman. His wife was Ann C. Whitman. Ann C. Whitman was President Dwight D. Eisenhower's personal secretary. She sat outside the Oval Office. She controlled the flow of paper to the commander-in-chief. This conflict of interest was absolute. It was suffocating. When the Dulles brothers received intelligence briefings about the situation in Guatemala, they were not viewing them objectively as statesmen protecting American national security. They were viewing them as former legal counsel and current shareholders protecting a massive corporate asset. To make sure Washington didn't lose focus, United Fruit hired Thomas "Tommy the Cork" Corcoran. He was a legendary Washington lobbyist, a fixer. Declassified documents show Corcoran roaming the halls of the State Department and the CIA, relentlessly pushing for action. He acted like a corporate whip, complaining when he felt the intelligence agencies were moving too slowly, demanding that the U.S. government deliver on United Fruit's request to remove Arbenz. But there was a hitch. You cannot tell the American public that you're going to send weapons, planes, and CIA operatives to overthrow a foreign democracy just to save a banana monopoly a few $1 million in taxes. The public won't buy it. Congress won't fund it. They needed a narrative. They needed to make the American people care about Guatemala. So, United Fruit hired the one man capable of hacking the American mind. Act 4. The Engineer of Consent. Edward Bernays was the nephew of Sigmund Freud. He's widely considered the father of public relations. He was a man who believed that the public mind was a raw material, a substrate that could be molded and shaped by whoever had the right tools. He called it the engineering of consent. United Fruit hired Bernays to solve their Guatemala problem. Bernays looked at the situation and realized immediately, the issue cannot be bananas. Bananas are boring. Land reform is boring. The year is 1953. The Cold War is freezing over. The Red Scare is at its height. Senator Joe McCarthy is looking for communists under every bed. Bernays decided to weaponize the zeitgeist. He decided to reframe a localized dispute over real estate valuation into an apocalyptic battle between Western civilization and the Soviet Union. Bernays was methodical. He approached propaganda as a science. First, he created a front organization called the Middle America Information Bureau. It sounded like an independent, objective think tank. In reality, it was a United Fruit propaganda mill. This bureau churned out hundreds of press releases, brochures, and research articles highlighting the growing Soviet beachhead in the Americas. They flooded the desks of newspaper editors, senators, and civic group leaders across the United States. Then Bernays targeted the press directly. He organized fact-finding junkets to Guatemala for the most influential journalists in America, writers from the New York Times, Time, Newsweek, and the Christian Science Monitor. Imagine you are one of these reporters. You are flown down to Central America on a private United Fruit Company airplane. You're put up in a luxurious United Fruit Company guest house. You're given top-shelf liquor and steaks. And then your friendly United Fruit handler takes you out to meet some locals. These locals are carefully vetted politicians and landlords who have been coached to tell you horrifying stories about the creeping Red Terror, about how the communists are taking over the government. It worked perfectly. The American press swallowed the narrative whole. Time magazine started running alarming stories referring to the president of Guatemala as Red Jacobo. But what happens when a journalist doesn't take the bait? Sidney Grusin was a respected foreign correspondent for the New York Times. He was in Guatemala doing actual reporting. He started filing stories that complicated Bernays' neat little narrative. Grusin wrote that Arbenz wasn't a communist, he was a nationalist. He wrote that the land reform was actually popular with the people. Edward Bernays and the Dulles brothers could not allow the paper of record to print the truth, so they applied pressure at the very top. They contacted Arthur Hayes Sulzberger, the publisher of the New York Times. They didn't argue facts with him. They used a smear campaign. They told Sulzberger that Sidney Grusin was politically compromised because his wife was rumored to have leftist leanings. Sulzberger caved. Just as the CIA was putting the final pieces of the coup into place, the New York Times reassigned Sidney Grusin. They pulled him out of Guatemala. Bernays had successfully blinded the American public. There would be no independent witnesses to what was about to happen. By the spring of 1954, Bernays was leaking fabricated intelligence to friendly columnists like Walter Winchell, claiming that Soviet submarines were actively surfacing off the coast of Guatemala. The American public was terrified. They firmly believed that a Soviet satellite state was being constructed just a 2-hour flight from New Orleans. The stage was set. The consent was engineered. Now it was time to kill a democracy. Act 5. Operation PBSUCCESS. In August of 1953, the National Security Council officially authorized the CIA to proceed. The code name, Operation PBSUCCESS. The budget, an initial $3 million, though estimates suggest it swelled to over $7 million. A staggering sum for a covert action at the time. The CIA needed a face for the operation. They couldn't just send in the Marines. They needed a Guatemalan to lead a rebellion. They rejected the moderate exiles. They wanted someone they could control. They selected Colonel Carlos Castillo Armas. If you read the declassified CIA psychological profiles of Castillo Armas, they are damning. The agency handlers described him as having, quote, limited intelligence but high malleability. He was a puppet, and he was perfect. They set Castillo Armas up in neighboring Honduras and Nicaragua. They gave him money, and he began to assemble a liberation army. Now, I want you to picture this army, because it's a joke. It consisted of roughly 480 men. Most of them were mercenaries, exiles, and paid thugs. Against the 5,000-man professional Guatemalan army, they posed zero military threat. If they met on an open battlefield, they would be wiped out in an afternoon. But the CIA knew that. Castillo Armas' troops weren't there to fight. They were there to act as extras in a movie. Their only purpose was to exist, so the CIA could tell the world there was a civil war happening. Because the real weapon of Operation PBSUCCESS wasn't bullets, it was psychology. Since they didn't have a real army, the CIA launched a massive psychological warfare campaign, Psy-War. We already talked about the radio station La Voz de la Liberación. They broadcasted patriotic anthems, fake news, and terrifying threats, claiming to be deep in the Guatemalan jungle while actually sitting comfortably in Nicaragua. But the psychological warfare went much, much darker than radio broadcasts. The CIA began planning for the aftermath. They began planning who would live and who would die. When the documents from PBSUCCESS were finally declassified in 1997, historians found the disposal lists. The CIA had categorized Guatemalan citizens. Category 1 meant imprisonment or exile. Category 2 meant executive action. Executive action is the CIA's bureaucratic term for assassination. To ensure the job was done right, the agency produced a 19-page manual. It was titled A Study of Assassination. This is one of the most chilling documents in American history. It reads like an instruction manual for a lawnmower, but it's about taking a human life. It offered cool, detached advice. It stated, the specific technique employed will depend upon the degree of privacy. It discussed the best weapon for close-range work. It explained how to puncture a man's organs with an ice pick. It explained how to stage accidents, falling from windows, drowning in bathtubs. The names on the disposal list were redacted when they were released to the public, but we know who they were. They were union organizers. They were peasant leaders. They were the administrators who had helped hand out the land under Decree 900. The CIA even mailed death notice cards to the homes of these men and women before the invasion even began, just to induce pure, paralyzing panic. By May of 1954, the coup was an open secret in Washington. But the CIA needed a final pretext, a spark to light the powder keg. They got it when a Swedish freighter named Alfhem docked in the Guatemalan port of Puerto Barrios. Deep inside the ship's hold were 2,000 tons of light arms and ammunition. Where did they come from? Czechoslovakia, behind the Iron Curtain. Now, why was Jacobo Arbenz buying weapons from the Soviet bloc? Because he had to. Since 1948, the United States had enforced a suffocating arms embargo against Guatemala. They refused to sell Arbenz even basic bullets for his police force. The Guatemalan army was literally running out of ammunition. When Arbenz tried to buy weapons from Western Europe, the U.S. State Department blocked the sales. The only people willing to sell him guns were the Czechs. It was a self-fulfilling prophecy. The U.S. backed Arbenz into a corner, forced him to buy Eastern Bloc weapons, and then, the moment the ship arrived, John Foster Dulles stepped up to the podium and declared it clinching proof of Soviet domination. The State Department exaggerated the shipment. They claimed these light rifles were enough to conquer the Panama Canal. They used the Alfhem incident to whip the U.S. Congress into a frenzy, and more importantly, to terrify the Guatemalan military high command. The clock had run out. Act 6, 10 Days in June. June 18th, 1954. Carlos Castillo Armas and his 480 mercenaries crossed the border from Honduras into Guatemala. As a military invasion, it was an utter embarrassment. They were immediately halted by local garrisons. They lost their initial skirmishes. They failed to capture a single major town. Castillo Armas was bogged down just miles from where he started. If this were a fair fight, it would have been over in 24 hours. But remember, the people in the capital couldn't see the border. They could only hear the radio. And the radio was telling them that Castillo Armas was an unstoppable juggernaut. Overhead, the CIA pilots were doing their work. American mercenaries, guys like Jerry DeLarme, flew unmarked planes over Guatemala City. They dropped dynamite. They blew up an empty oil tank. They strafed the military barracks. They weren't destroying the army. They were destroying the army's nerve. The deciding factor didn't happen on a battlefield. It happened in a quiet room. The U.S. ambassador to Guatemala was a man named John Purifoy. Purifoy was a hard-drinking, pistol-packing diplomat who treated Guatemala like a conquered province. As the fake bombing campaign raged outside, Purifoy called a meeting with the Guatemalan Army High Command. He didn't negotiate. He gave them an ultimatum. He looked the generals in the eye and made it crystal clear. If the Guatemalan Army did not remove their own president, Jacobo Arbenz, the United States Marines would land on their shores. The generals broke. Terrified by the prospect of a full-scale U.S. invasion and deeply demoralized by the relentless psychological warfare, the officers turned their backs on the Constitution. Out in the countryside, the peasant militias and the labor unions were begging for weapons. They wanted to fight Castillo Armas. They wanted to defend the 10 years of spring. The generals refused to open the armories. They locked the guns away. On the night of June 27, 1954, Jacobo Arbenz sat before a microphone. His voice was somber, exhausted. He addressed the nation and he announced his resignation. He said he was stepping down to prevent the fruitless bloodshed of the people. He knew the fix was in. He sought asylum in the Mexican embassy across town. But the corporate war requires total submission. Winning isn't enough. You have to humiliate the loser so no one ever tries it again. When Arbenz and his family were finally granted safe passage out of the country, they drove to the airport. The press was waiting, flashbulbs popping. The new military junta authorities stopped the former president at the gate. Right there, in front of the cameras, they forced Jacobo Arbenz to strip down to his underwear. They claimed they were searching him for smuggled gold. It was a lie. It was a final, petty act of degradation. They wanted the world to see the man who dared to challenge the octopus, stripped of his dignity, standing half naked on the tarmac of his own country. He boarded the plane. He flew into exile. The 10 years of spring were over. The long, dark winter had begun. Act 7. The Externalities. In economics, there's a concept called an externality. An externality is a cost or a consequence of a commercial activity that affects other parties, but isn't reflected in the cost of the goods or services. When a factory dumps toxic waste into a river and the town downstream gets sick, the sickness is an externality. It doesn't show up on the factory's balance sheet. So now let's take a look at the externalities of Operation PBSUCCESS. Carlos Castillo Armas was installed as the dictator of Guatemala, and he immediately gave the United Fruit Company exactly what they had paid for. Decree 900, the Agrarian Reform Law, was instantly canceled. Over 1.5 million acres of land that had been given to poor, starving families was violently seized back by the state and returned to the United Fruit Company and the landed oligarchy. The new junta dissolved the major labor confederations. They outlawed the peasant unions. Thousands of labor leaders, activists, and teachers, the people on the CIA's disposal lists, were arrested, tortured, or executed. And of course, the government abolished taxes on interest and dividends for foreign investors. The tax haven was restored. To cleanse the culture, Castillo Armas established the National Committee for Defense Against Communism. They had the power to arrest anyone, at any time, for any reason. In the center of the capital, the military organized public book burnings. They threw works by Victor Hugo, Fyodor Dostoevsky, and even Guatemala's own future Nobel laureate Miguel Ángel Asturias into the flames. But you cannot put the genie back in the bottle. By destroying the political center, by removing a moderate democratic reformer like Arbenz, the United States ensured that the only avenue left for change in Guatemala was armed struggle. Because when you make peaceful reform impossible, you make violent revolution inevitable. In 1960, a group of young, disgusted military officers revolted. When their coup failed, they fled into the mountains and formed the first guerrilla groups. This was the spark of the Guatemalan Civil War. The war lasted for 36 years. It evolved from a political conflict into a horrific ethnic slaughter. The Guatemalan military state, heavily funded and radicalized by U.S. counterinsurgency training, came to view the entire indigenous Mayan population as the enemy. They believed the Mayans were the water in which the guerrilla fish swam. So they decided to boil the water. In the early 1980s, under the dictator Efraín Ríos Montt, the army launched a scorched earth campaign. They wiped hundreds of Mayan villages off the map. Years later, the United Nations Historical Clarification Commission investigated this era. The toll is beyond comprehension. Over 200,000 people were killed or disappeared. 83% of the victims were indigenous Mayans. And the UN Commission found that 93% of the human rights violations were committed by the state forces and paramilitaries. The commission officially concluded that agents of the state of Guatemala had committed acts of genocide. 200,000 dead. A 36-year civil war. Genocide. A region utterly destabilized, creating ripples of trauma and mass migration that we are still dealing with today. All of these things are the externalities of the banana trade. None of that blood ever showed up on the quarterly earnings reports in Boston. And what happened to the victors? Carlos Castillo Armas, the CIA's malleable puppet, was assassinated by one of his own palace guards just 3 years later in 1957. As for the United Fruit Company, the victory was hollow. The sheer brazenness of the coup actually drew antitrust attention from the U.S. Justice Department. The company was eventually forced to sell off assets. They began a long, slow decline. In 1970, they merged with another company to hide the tainted name, becoming United Brands. In 1975, the CEO of United Brands, a man named Eli Black, used his briefcase to smash through the thick glass window of his corner office on the 44th floor of the Pan Am building in New York City. He jumped to his death, landing on Park Avenue. It was an ending as sudden and violent as the history of the company he ran. Today, the company still exists. They rebranded again. You know them well. You see their stickers in the produce aisle of your grocery store. Bright blue and yellow. Cheerful. Harmless. Chiquita Brands International. Next time you peel one of those bananas, think about the soil it was grown in. Think about Sam Zamuri, the Dulles brothers, and Edward Bernays. Think about Jacobo Arbenz, stripped down to his underwear on an airport tarmac. They tell you that capitalism and democracy go hand in hand. But the Republic of Fruit proves that when the profit margin is wide enough, a corporation will consume a democracy whole, spit out the bones, and convince the world it was doing them a favor. This has been Corporate Wars. If you want to read more about the CIA's disposal lists and the PR machine that destroyed Guatemala, check out the sources I used researching this episode, including Bitter Fruit, the story of the American coup in Guatemala by Stephen Schlesinger and Stephen Kinzer, as well as The Banana, Empires, Trade Wars, and Globalization. Next week, we're leaving the jungle and heading into the living rooms of the 80s and 90s as we dive deep into the console wars with upstart Sega challenging Nintendo for after-school supremacy. I'm Tomislav Kramzel. Remember, business is just war by other means. I'll see you next time.